Have you got money for another week, Mrs. Bennet? The boarding house keeper did not raise her voice, which made the words carry worse in the narrow front hall. Clara Bennet stood with her carpetbag at her feet and the unfinished quilt folded over one arm, its faded blue squares showing where her fingers had worried the cloth thin. Behind her, the supper room had gone quiet. Forks rested against plates. Chairs creaked once and then did not move. She had known the question was coming since morning, when Mrs. Adler had counted the coins in Clara's palm twice and still found them short. Clara looked at the woman, then at the staircase she would not be climbing again. "No, ma'am," she said. Mrs. Adler's mouth tightened, not unkindly, but not enough to change anything. "I cannot keep a room on promises. Not with coal at $8 a ton and winter sitting right on the road." Clara nodded. She did not explain that the black dress in her bag had been turned twice and would not turn a third time. She did not say that 3 houses had refused her mending that week because respectable women had begun lowering their voices when she passed. She did not mention the name people had put on her since Daniel Bennet died, owing more than anyone had guessed. A foolish widow, a proud widow, a woman who had not known how to keep her husband from ruin, as if a wife could hold back debt with 2 hands and a sewing needle. She bent and lifted the carpetbag. One of the men near the stove looked down into his coffee. Mrs. Pruitt, sitting by the window, watched Clara's quilt with the sharp interest of someone already preparing the story for tomorrow. Clara kept her chin level and walked to the door. The cold met her before she stepped outside. It came under her collar and through the worn seams at her cuffs. Main Street was mostly dark, with lamplight showing in narrow strips beneath shop doors and frost silvering the wagon ruts. She stood on the boarding house steps and adjusted the quilt over her arm, careful not to let the edge drag in the dirty snow. It was the last good thing she owned because it was not yet finished. Finished things could be sold. Unfinished things still held a little mercy. Down the street, the church bell struck once for the half hour. Clara counted the sound without meaning to. She had 3 cents in her pocket, 1 needle tucked into her sleeve, and no place to sit where the cold would not find her. She started toward the livery first, then stopped. Mr. Haskins had let her sleep there once in October, before the rumors had hardened. He would not risk it now. Across the street, a wagon stood outside the mercantile, loaded with sacks of feed and a coil of new rope. A man came out carrying a small sack of flour under one arm. Ethan Walker. She knew him the way everyone in town knew him, by his quiet, by the ranch south of the creek, by the little girl who sometimes rode beside him with both hands on the saddle horn. He paused under the mercantile lamp. His eyes moved from the carpetbag to the quilt, then to the boarding house door closing behind her. Clara turned away before pity could reach his face. She had taken 3 steps when his boots sounded on the frozen boards behind her, steady and unhurried, not chasing her, only closing the distance enough that his voice would not have to travel through the whole street. "Mrs. Bennet," he said. She stopped with one hand tight around the carpetbag handle. The wind lifted the loose corner of the quilt and pressed it against her dress. Ethan looked at the dark street ahead, then at the thin shawl pulled over her shoulders. He did not ask what she had done. He did not ask what people were saying. He only took off one glove, reached into his coat, and drew out a folded piece of feed twine as if his hands needed something practical to do before his mouth could manage the rest. "Have you got somewhere warm tonight?" Clara did not answer at once. The question had been too plain to hide from. She looked past Ethan to the mercantile window, where her own reflection stood thin and dark against the lamplight, quilt on one arm, bag in one hand, a woman arranged for leaving. "I can manage," she said, because those were the words left to a person after everything useful had been spent. Ethan nodded once, as if he had expected no other answer. He did not move. Closer. He did not lower his voice into sympathy. He only looked toward the livery, then toward the road leading out of town, both places colder than the street. "There is a room beside my barn," he said. "It has a stove. Door latches from the inside. You can stay the night and decide in the morning." Clara held the carpetbag handle until the wire frame pressed into her palm. Across the street, Mrs. Pruitt had come to the boarding house window. A curtain shifted and settled. Ethan saw it. He stepped back, giving Clara space enough to refuse without making a scene. That small courtesy did more than any urging could have done. She looked at the wagon. Feed sacks. Flour. A folded horse blanket on the bench. Nothing prepared for a guest. No trap laid out pretty enough to mistrust. Just a working man with work still in his wagon and snow collecting on his hat brim. Only tonight, she said. Ethan picked up her carpet bag before the words had finished leaving her mouth. Not quickly, not as if claiming it, but because it was heavy and his hands were empty. He set it in the wagon bed, away from the feed, then placed the quilt on top where it would stay clean. Clara climbed onto the wagon seat without his help, and he did not offer it. He only waited until her skirt was clear of the wheel before taking the reins. The town watched them leave. Clara kept both gloved hands folded in her lap as the wagon rolled south, past the church, past the last dark storefront, past the place where lamplight ended. Ethan said nothing for the first mile. The horse knew the road and took it steady. After a while, he reached behind the seat and drew the folded horse blanket over, setting it between them. Clara looked at it. Wind cuts harder after the creek, he said. That was all. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders when the first gust struck. The wool smelled of hay, leather, and cold air. It was not kindness made for display. It was simply warmth placed where she could reach it. The ranch lamps appeared nearly 3 miles later, low and yellow against the dark. A dog barked once from somewhere near the barn, then quieted when Ethan spoke its name. He drove past the house. Instead of stopping there, Clara noticed that. She noticed everything now. He halted beside a small lean-to room built against the south wall of the barn. Smoke already threaded faintly from the stovepipe. I keep it warm when we are expecting a calf, he said, stepping down. No calf tonight. He opened the door and set her bag just inside, then turned the key in the lock and placed it on the table, not in his pocket. Clara stood in the doorway with the quilt held against her. Inside were a narrow cot, a washstand, a stack of firewood, and a lamp turned low. On the chair lay a clean towel, folded square. Ethan touched the brim of his hat. House is 50 yards up. Kitchen door faces this way. There will be coffee at first light. Then he walked back into the snow before she could thank him, leaving the warm room, the key, and the choice entirely in her hands. Clara stood inside the room until Ethan's footsteps faded toward the house. Only then did she close the door and slide the bolt. The sound was small, but it belonged to her. She set the key beside the lamp and looked around the room without touching anything at first. The stove gave off a steady heat. The cot had a clean quilt folded at the foot, plain brown and worn thin at the corners. The washstand held a basin, a bar of yellow soap, and a pitcher with a chipped handle. Nothing fine, nothing careless. She laid her unfinished quilt across the chair and smoothed one blue square with her fingertips. The thread there had loosened during the ride. She took the needle from her sleeve and fixed it before removing her coat, because a torn thing left alone only tore wider. Outside, the wind moved along the barn wall. Once, a horse shifted in its stall. Clara sat on the edge of the cot and listened to the ranch settling into night. No laughter from the boarding house supper room. No voices dropping when she passed. No door opening to tell her she had become too expensive to keep. Just wood heat, hay smell, and the soft tick of the stove cooling between breaths of flame. She slept with the key under her palm. At first light, a rooster called from the yard, and Clara woke before the room had fully brightened. Old habit put her feet on the floor quickly. She folded the brown quilt, shook out her dress, and rebuilt the fire with 2 sticks from the stack. Then she opened the door. Snow lay thin over the yard. The house stood 50 yards away, smoke rising from the kitchen chimney. On the small table just outside her door sat a tin cup of coffee, a covered plate, and a note held down by a smooth stone. Clara picked up the note. Kitchen is warm if you want more. No name. No flourish. She lifted the cloth from the plate. 2 biscuits. A slice of ham. Apple butter in a spoonful-sized dish. She stood there long enough for the coffee steam to touch her face. Then she carried the cup and plate back inside and ate slowly, saving half a biscuit without deciding why. By the time she reached the kitchen door, Ethan was outside by the woodpile, splitting kindling with even strokes. He saw her and stopped only long enough to nod toward the stove. Coffee is on. Clara stepped into the kitchen. It was clean, but a little bare in the way houses grew when no woman had been asked to make them soft for a long time. A table stood in the center with 3 chairs, though only 2 places had been set. The third chair sat pushed against the wall, empty and dusted, as if it had been kept but not used. Clara noticed the chair. Then she noticed the little girl standing in the doorway beyond it, hair uncombed on one side, watching Clara with both hands wrapped around a rag doll. Ethan came in behind Clara with an armload of wood and set it beside the stove. "This is Annie," he said. The child did not speak. Clara did not move toward her. She only reached into her apron pocket, took out the half biscuit wrapped in cloth, and placed it on the edge of the table where a small hand could reach it if it chose. Annie looked at the biscuit for a long time before taking it. She did not say thank you, but she carried it to the empty chair against the wall and stood beside it while she ate, as if the chair belonged to someone who might come back if nobody moved it. Clara kept her eyes on the stove. Ethan set the last of the wood in the box, washed his hands at the basin, and put a small pan of oats on without asking anyone whether they wanted breakfast. The house made its morning sounds around them. Fire catching, spoon against pot, wind at the window, Annie's small teeth breaking the biscuit in careful bites. When the oats were ready, Ethan filled 2 bowls, then paused. He looked at the third chair, then at Clara. "There is enough," he said. Not an invitation dressed up in politeness, just a fact placed on the table. Clara took the bowl because she had slept under his roof and eaten his food already, and pretending otherwise would not make her less beholden. She sat where he pointed, not in the empty chair, but at the side near the stove. Annie watched that, too. After breakfast, Clara carried her bowl to the washstand. The dishwater had gone cool, and the pump bucket was nearly empty, so she took it outside before anyone asked. The pump handle was stiff with frost. She worked it until water broke loose in a hard silver rush and filled the bucket halfway. On her way back, she saw the ranch as daylight revealed it. A barn needing one hinge reset, shirts frozen on a line, kindling stacked neat but too low, a child's mitten caught on the fence rail. A house managed but not mended. When she came inside, Ethan was buttoning his coat for the yard. He stopped when he saw the bucket in her hand. "You do not have to earn breakfast before it settles," he said. Clara set the bucket by the stove. "I know." She took the dishcloth from the nail. "But cold water waits for nobody." His mouth moved almost into a smile and did not finish. Then he went out. Annie remained near the wall, doll tucked under one arm, watching Clara wash the bowls, wipe the table, and straighten the towel by the basin. The child did not come closer until Clara drew the unfinished quilt from her own bag and laid it across her lap, near the stove to check the loose seams. Annie crossed the kitchen one floorboard at a time. "That yours?" Clara nodded. "Not finished yet." Annie touched one faded blue square with 2 fingers. "Mama had a blue dress." The room held still. Clara did not look toward the empty chair. She threaded her needle slowly, giving the child time to take the words back if she wanted. Annie did not. She only watched the needle pass through cloth. "Blue is a good color for staying," Clara said. Annie leaned against the table, close enough that her sleeve brushed the quilt. Outside, Ethan's axe struck wood in a steady rhythm. Inside, Clara took one small torn corner and began setting it right. By the second morning, Clara had learned the shape of the Walker house without asking for any part of it to be hers. The kitchen door swelled at the bottom and had to be lifted before it latched. The stove drew better if the left damper was opened first. Annie would eat oats if apple butter was stirred in, but only after watching someone else take the first bite. Ethan's blue work shirt had a tear under the arm that had been mended once with thread too dark and too thick. Clara noticed these things because noticing was work, and work was safer than hoping. She did not enter rooms that were not open. She did not sit in the empty chair. Each night she returned to the little room beside the barn, turned the key herself, and folded her quilt over the foot of the cot. Each morning, coffee appeared on the outside table before she opened the door. By the third morning, a small bundle of clean scraps lay beside it. Brown wool, 2 pieces of calico, and a square of faded blue from something that had been washed soft over years. No note. Clara carried the bundle into the kitchen and found Ethan at the stove, turning flapjacks with the care of a man who could mend a fence line in sleet, but still burned breakfast at the edges. "Found those in the dry chest," he said. "Thought they might be useful." Clara set the blue square on her palm. Across the room, Annie stopped combing her doll's hair. Clara saw it and folded the cloth back into the bundle without comment. After breakfast, she asked for the mending basket. Ethan looked toward the shelf above the pantry door, where a wooden box sat pushed back and dusty. He brought it down and set it on the table. He did not open it. Annie climbed into the chair nearest the stove and tucked both feet under her skirt. Clara lifted the lid. Inside were buttons, carded thread, a thimble, 2 bone needles, and a strip of blue ribbon wrapped around a spool. Nobody spoke. Clara closed her fingers around nothing. She only looked long enough to know this had belonged to the woman whose chair still waited by the wall. "I can use my own needle," she said. Ethan nodded once, took the ribbon from the top, and placed it carefully back inside before sliding the box toward the window where the light was better. Permission without surrender. That was what it felt like. Clara started with the work shirt, then Annie's mitten, then the torn flour sack that had been spilling a white trail from pantry to stove. By noon, 3 small repairs sat folded on the table, not pretty enough to be praised, but strong enough to last. Ethan came in for coffee, picked up the shirt, and turned the seam between his fingers. "That will hold," he said. Clara tied off the last stitch. "It should." He put the shirt beside his coat, then went back outside and reset the loose barn hinge before she mentioned it. She watched from the kitchen window as he worked in the cold, shoulders bent, hat brim low, the hinge lifting true under his hands. By evening, Clara had taken the leftover ham bone, beans, and 1 onion gone soft at the edge and made supper stretch for 3. Annie carried spoons to the table without being asked. She set 1 at Ethan's place, 1 at Clara's, then stood with the 3rd spoon in her hand. The empty chair waited against the wall. Clara kept stirring the pot. Ethan washed at the basin and saw his daughter standing there. He did not tell her what to do. Annie looked at the spoon, then laid it carefully beside Clara's bowl instead. Not the empty chair. Beside Clara's bowl. Clara's hand paused on the ladle, only for a breath. Then she filled the bowls, one after another, while the unfinished quilt lay folded near the stove, the new blue square resting on top, as if it had found where it might belong. The spoon beside Clara's bowl stayed there the next morning. Annie did not speak of it. She only set it down again when she laid the table, careful and quick, then watched Clara from under her lashes to see whether it would be moved. Clara left it where it was. That was enough for the child to breathe easier. The days settled around small work. Ethan rode fence before sunup and came back with frost on his coat. Clara kept coffee warm without making a ceremony of it. Annie brought kindling in 2 sticks at a time, then stood near Clara's elbow while the quilt grew across her lap. The faded blue square Ethan had found was washed, pressed, and cut into 4 smaller pieces. Clara used 1 near the center, not because it matched, but because it mattered. Annie noticed. She touched it once after supper, then pulled her hand back. "That was from Mama's apron," she said. Clara kept her needle still. "Then it should be somewhere strong." Annie nodded, solemn as church. After that, she began bringing scraps from places Clara would not have looked. A torn cuff from Ethan's old coat, a piece of flour sack with 1 red stripe, a brown square from a blanket the dog had chewed years before. Clara accepted each piece the same way, turning it in the light, checking the weave, finding where it could hold. Ethan watched from the doorway sometimes, saying nothing, his hat in both hands when he had meant to come in and fetch something. One afternoon, Clara found a loose button on Annie's winter coat and asked for 5 minutes of patience. Annie climbed onto the kitchen chair and sat stiff-backed while Clara worked. When the needle passed close, the child flinched, then stayed because Clara's hand was steady and her voice remained low, counting stitches under her breath. Ethan came in halfway through with an armload of wood. He saw Annie sitting still, saw Clara's fingers moving carefully at his daughter's collar, and set the wood down softer than the weight required. Later, when Clara returned to the barn room, she found the draft under the door had been blocked with a fitted strip of wood. No note, no mention at supper, just less cold waiting for her when she slept. The next day, Clara found a jar of lamp oil by her stove and 2 extra logs stacked inside, where snow could not reach them. She answered in the only way that did not make either kindness too large. She patched Ethan's torn glove, mended Annie's doll where the seam had opened, and scrubbed the kitchen shelf until the jars stood straight and labeled. That evening, Annie fell asleep at the table before finishing her milk. Ethan reached to lift her, but Clara had already folded the quilt around the child's shoulders so the cold hall would not wake her. He stopped with 1 hand on the chair back. Clara looked down at the sleeping girl, 1 hand resting lightly on the quilt. Ethan looked at both of them for a long moment, then moved the empty chair from the wall and set it at the table where it belonged. The empty chair did not change everything at once. It only changed where Annie put the 3rd spoon the next morning, and where Ethan rested his hand when he stood by the table, and where Clara's eyes went before she reminded herself not to expect too much from wood and habit. By noon, the sky had turned the flat white color that came before hard weather. Ethan noticed it first. He came in from the yard, looked once toward the north ridge, and began moving with quiet purpose. Feet hauled closer to the barn. Extra water drawn. Lanterns checked. The storm arrived before supper, striking the windows with snow as fine and hard as sand. Clara helped without being told, filling the wood box, setting bread near the stove, folding blankets over chair backs where hands could find them in the dark. Annie stayed close, her doll under one arm, trying to be useful and small at the same time. Near dusk, Ethan realized the young heifer in the south pen had not come under shelter. He took his coat from the peg. "I will be 10 minutes," he said. Clara saw Annie's face change. Not loudly, just the mouth tightening, the fingers closing around the doll's cloth body. Ethan saw it too. He crouched, adjusted the child's collar, and set his glove against her cheek for one steady second before going out. The door shut behind him, and the house took in the storm. Clara kept Annie busy with thread. She let her sort blue squares from brown ones, then flour sack from wool, while the wind leaned against the walls. 10 minutes passed. Then, 15. Clara did not say so. She set another log in the stove. The kitchen dimmed. Annie looked toward the window. "Papa knows the way," Clara said, because that was true enough to stand on. Then the dog barked from the barn. Once. Twice. A sound cut short by weather. Annie moved before Clara could reach her, slipping from the chair and through the kitchen door into the white. Clara was after her in the same breath. The cold took her face first. She caught sight of Annie near the woodpile, small against the snow, turning the wrong way toward the open yard. Clara wrapped one arm around the child and pulled the quilt from her own shoulders around both of them. Not the brown house quilt. Her quilt. The unfinished one. Blue squares, flour sack, torn coat cloth, all of it whipping in the wind as she bent low and found the fence line by touch. Step by step, she brought Annie back toward the kitchen light. At the porch, Ethan came out of the storm carrying a lantern, snow on his hat, and fear plain in the set of his mouth. He reached them at the steps. He did not scold the child. He did not speak at all at first. He only took Annie inside, then turned back and saw Clara still standing in the doorway, hands numb around the quilt, making sure the girl was warm before she moved herself. Ethan set the lantern down, took the wet quilt from Clara's stiff fingers, and wrapped his own dry coat around her shoulders. Then he opened the door wider, not to the barn room, not to the yard, but into the house. The coat around Clara's shoulders was too large and still held the shape of Ethan's work. She stood just inside the kitchen while snow melted from her hem, and Annie sat near the stove wrapped in a dry blanket, both hands around a cup of warm milk. Ethan closed the door against the storm, then took Clara's unfinished quilt to the line near the stove and spread it carefully over 2 chair backs. He did not shake it hard. He handled it like something living could be hurt by roughness. One blue square had torn loose at the corner. Clara saw it and took one step forward, but Ethan had already reached for the mending basket on the shelf. He set it on the table. Then he pulled out the empty chair for her. Not by the wall, not near the stove as a guest. At the table, Clara sat because her knees had begun to remember the cold. Ethan put coffee in front of her, then went to Annie, felt the child's hands, and tucked the blanket closer around her feet. No one spoke of fear. The house did not need the words. In the morning, the storm had passed, but the road to town lay white and rutted under a hard sky. Clara rose early, intending to return to the barn room before daylight made the night seem larger than it was. Her carpet bag still sat there. Her key still lay on the little table. She opened the kitchen door and found Ethan already outside, hitching the wagon. Annie stood on the porch in her coat, holding the repaired doll tight. In the wagon bed sat Clara's carpet bag. Beside it was the unfinished quilt, folded dry, the torn blue square pinned neatly in place for mending. Clara looked from the wagon to Ethan. He tightened the last strap, then lifted his eyes to her. "Mrs. Adler sent word with Haskins," he said. "Said your room is gone." Clara held the door frame. Ethan stepped to the wagon bed, lifted her carpet bag, and carried it back past her into the house. He set it inside the kitchen, beside the chair Annie had moved close to the table. Then he took the barn room key from his pocket and laid it on the shelf by the door, no longer between them. "There is no need for you to sleep out there," he said. Annie came in behind him and placed the doll on Clara's chair, saving it. Clara looked at the bag, the chair, the quilt, the child. Ethan put his hat back on and reached for the reins. "I have business in town," he said. "If they have more to say about you, they can say it to me." By the time Ethan returned from town, the winter sun had dropped behind the barn and the house windows were gold with lamplight. Clara had not asked Annie what he had said there. She only kept her hands busy. The torn blue square was stitched back into the quilt, stronger than before, with tiny even seams that would not give way easily. Annie had sorted buttons by color, then fallen asleep with her head on one folded arm near the edge of the table. Clara covered her with the finished quilt and sat beside her, needle resting in her lap. Ethan came in quietly, bringing cold air and the smell of horses with him. He hung his hat on the peg, looked at the carpet bag still by the kitchen chair, and then at Clara. He did not repeat the town's words. He did not give them a place in the room. He only took off his gloves and set a small parcel on the table. Inside was a spool of blue thread, a packet of needles, and a folded length of plain white cotton. "Mercantile had what you needed," he said. Clara touched the thread with one finger. "Useful things. Chosen things. Things bought for tomorrow." Annie stirred and blinked awake. When she saw Ethan, she sat up fast, then saw Clara still there and settled again. Ethan moved the empty chair closer to the table until its legs stood square on the worn floorboards. "Supper smells ready," he said. Clara rose and filled 3 bowls. No one told her where to sit. Annie had already placed the spoon there. They ate while the stove clicked softly and snow slid from the eaves outside. Later, Clara folded the quilt and laid it across the back of her chair, not over her arm, not near her bag, not ready for leaving. Ethan noticed. His hand rested for a moment on the chair back, close to the blue square, but not touching it. Annie leaned against Clara's side, sleepy and warm. "Will it stay here?" the child asked. Clara looked at the quilt, then at the table, the stove, the man standing quiet beside them, and the door that had not closed against her. "Yes," she said. "It will stay here."